The quiz was to sketch the graphs of all these functions, make the table and sketch the graph. On the homework I noticed that a lot of people weren't using x equals -1/2 and x equals 1/2 on a lot of these functions. Remember that the idea is you use the numbers -2, -1, -1/2, 0, 1/2, 1, and 2 in making your table. These are your x values, unless it's impossible to evaluate the function. If, for example, the function is undefined for a certain value, or you can't express the result exactly. You can't calculate it, and the only way you can get an indication of that number is to put it into a calculator, and we're not using calculators. And that's the case for the 2 to the x function when x is -1/2 or 1/2. Okay, so for this function we're not going to use -1/2 or 1/2. You don't know how to calculate 2 to the 1/2. And you're not going to know how to calculate it except to punch it into a calculator, which doesn't give you an exact value, and we're only using numbers that give us exact values. So, for all the other functions, though, we will use -1/2 and 1/2 because they can be evaluated exactly. Okay, related, on the homework, I noticed, in addition to a lot of people leaving out these values for functions where they could have been used, for example, for the y equals 1/x graph, there's some confusion about what you do between the point here and the point here. Okay, now these are points on the y equals 1/x graph, so this would be the 1/2 point, the 1, x equals 1, x equals 2. And here it'd be x equals -2, -1, -1/2. And you get these points, and people will then want to connect these points. And that isn't a bad thing to have done on the homework, because I hadn't told you about this, but now I'm telling you. So I say, in the same sense as the old cartographers would draw a map of the world, and in some point, some parts of the ocean, they would say, "Here be monsters." Okay? Well, for the 1/x function, which is undefined when x equals 0, well, where is x equals 0 on this graph? Well, at every point on the y-axis, the x-coordinate is 0. So I'm going to say, here be x equals 0, in the same sense as here be monsters. Okay? Here's where x equals 0. Graph doesn't exist on this line. There's no point on this line that corresponds to the 1/x function. So graph doesn't exist here. So you cannot extend the graph across this line. So you don't join this point to this one, because that would, of course, extend the graph across a line where it's undefined. So you simply don't do that. There's more to that, and there's more to the way this graph looks if you extend it to some values of x that approach 0 into larger and larger values of x. The graph extends this way, and it becomes clear from the way the graph extends that you're not going to be joining these points. In any case, because the graph, for right now, because the graph is undefined, you don't join these points. These points don't connect to each other. They connect to the other points on this side. And what we get is a graph that does one thing on this side of the point where the function is undefined, and something else on this side. Now those two things are related, but they don't connect.